The active shooter alert went out during lunch, but the principal announced over the intercom, "Ignore that. Someone's playing a prank." The cafeteria went silent for exactly 3 seconds when the alert hit every phone simultaneously. I remember that silence like a physical presence, heavy and electric, the kind that makes your ears ring. Then Principal Douglas Whitmore's voice crackled through the intercom speakers mounted in the ceiling corners, casual and almost annoyed, like we'd interrupted his lunch. "Attention students and staff. Please ignore that alert. Someone's playing a prank. Continue with your lunch period." The collective exhale of 400 students filled the room. Nervous laughter rippled across tables. My best friend Jalen looked at me and shrugged, stabbing his fork back into his mashed potatoes. But I didn't move. My phone was still in my hand, the emergency alert glowing on the screen, and something in my chest had turned to ice. I'd heard a sound 30 seconds before that alert went out. A sound from the east corridor that I'd dismissed as a locker slamming. I know now it wasn't a locker. It was the first shot. I'd been a junior at Westbrook Regional High School for almost 3 years by that point, and like most kids who'd grown up in that building since freshman year, I'd learned to trust the adults who ran the place. Principal Whitmore had been there longer than anyone could remember, a fixture of the community with his silver hair and his motivational posters and his firm handshake at every graduation ceremony. He coached Little League in the summers. He attended every football game. Parents loved him because he sent personalized emails when their kids made honor roll, and teachers loved him because he backed them up in parent conferences. I had no reason to question him when his voice came through that speaker. None of us did. We'd been trained our whole lives to listen to authority, to assume the adults knew things we didn't, to trust that the systems in place would protect us. That training almost got us killed. The East Corridor was where the science classrooms were located, a long hallway with trophy cases and motivational banners, and those industrial gray lockers that echoed when you slammed them too hard. I knew the layout because my chemistry class was down there third period, and I'd walked that hallway 1,000 times without thinking about it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew while we sat in that cafeteria convincing ourselves everything was fine, was that a former student named Wesley Granger had entered through the service entrance near the loading dock at approximately 12:15 that afternoon. He was carrying a duffel bag. He'd been expelled 8 months earlier for threatening a teacher, and he'd spent those 8 months planning his return. The security cameras caught everything. I've watched that footage more times than I should have. The way he walked, calm and purposeful. The way he unzipped the bag in the stairwell. The way he started down that corridor exactly 90 seconds before the automated alert system detected gunfire and sent the warning to every phone in the building. Principal Whitmore was in his office when the alert went out. His secretary, a woman named Linda Okonkwo, who'd worked at the school for 22 years, later testified that she saw the alert on her phone and immediately stood up to initiate lockdown procedures. She said Whitmore waved her off. He told her it was probably just kids messing with the system, that there'd been a false alarm at Lincoln Middle School the week before, that he'd handle it. She asked if they should at least verify with the police. He picked up his desk phone, dialed the front office, spoke to someone for maybe 15 seconds, and then walked to the intercom panel on his wall. She watched him press the button. She heard him dismiss the alert as a prank. Then he sat back down and continued eating his sandwich. Linda told investigators she felt a cold dread in that moment, a certainty that something was wrong, but she'd worked under Whitmore for over 2 decades and had never once seen him make a serious mistake. So she sat back down too. We all did, in our own ways. The second shot came at 12:23, and this time I heard it clearly. It wasn't a locker slam. It wasn't a car backfiring in the parking lot. It was a sharp, unmistakable crack that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, and I was on my feet before my brain had fully processed what I was hearing. Jalen grabbed my arm and asked what the hell I was doing, and I said I didn't know, which was the truth. I just knew I couldn't sit there anymore. The cafeteria monitors, 2 paraprofessionals named Mrs. Evelyn Tate and Mr. Deshaun Brooks, were standing near the doors looking confused, their radios crackling with static. I watched Mr. Brooks try to reach someone on his walkie. No response. He tried again. Nothing. Then a third shot, closer this time, and suddenly everyone heard it. The screaming started immediately, that primal sound of collective panic that I still hear in my nightmares. Kids were diving under tables, running for exits, trampling each other in the chaos. Mrs. Tate was shouting for everyone to get down, to stay calm, but her voice was shaking so badly the words came out fractured and wrong. I pushed through the crowd toward the kitchen entrance because my sister Olivia had 4th period lunch in the auxiliary cafeteria, which was connected to the main kitchen, and I needed to find her. I needed to know she was okay. The kitchen was chaos incarnate when I burst through those swinging doors. Lunch staff were screaming, students were crying, and someone had knocked over a massive pot of soup that was spreading across the tile floor in a steaming orange wave. I spotted Olivia immediately, crouched behind a stainless steel prep table with 2 of her friends, her face pale and tear-streaked but alive, definitely alive. I ran to her and grabbed her arm and told her we needed to move, that we needed to get out of the building right now. She asked about Mom, about whether I'd called her, and I realized I hadn't even thought to try. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the emergency alert still glowing on the screen like an accusation. I pulled Olivia toward the loading dock exit, the same entrance Wesley Granger had used less than 10 minutes earlier, and we ran into the afternoon sunlight with our hearts pounding and our lungs burning, and the sound of sirens already wailing in the distance. We made it. We were lucky. Not everyone was. 7 people were shot that day. 3 of them died before the paramedics arrived. The victims were a freshman girl named Destiny Washington, who'd been walking to her locker when Wesley came around the corner. A chemistry teacher named Dr. Robert Kimura, who'd heard the shots and stepped into the hallway to investigate. And a senior named Amari Oyalaran, who'd been trying to help Destiny when the second round of shots came. 4 others were wounded, including a janitor named Frank Delacroix, who'd tried to tackle Wesley near the trophy cases and taken a bullet to the shoulder for his bravery. Police arrived within 4 minutes of the first 911 call, which came from a student hiding in a bathroom with her phone. Wesley was apprehended in the gymnasium, where he'd apparently gone looking for the coach who'd cut him from the basketball team 2 years earlier. He surrendered without resistance. The whole nightmare lasted less than 15 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like a lifetime. The aftermath was a blur of police tape and news cameras and grief counselors stationed in every corner of the building. They closed the school for a week. They held candlelit vigils. They planted 3 trees in the courtyard, 1 for each of the students and staff who wouldn't be coming back. Principal Whitmore stood at the podium during the memorial service and spoke about tragedy and resilience and the strength of the Westbrook community, and I watched him from the 3rd row with my mother's hand gripping mine so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. He looked genuinely devastated. I'll give him that. His voice broke when he said Destiny's name, but I couldn't stop thinking about that intercom announcement. I couldn't stop hearing his casual dismissal, his confident assurance that everything was fine, his instruction to continue eating our lunches while a shooter stalked the hallways. My mother must have felt me tense because she leaned over and whispered that it wasn't his fault, that nobody could have known, that we shouldn't blame ourselves or others for what one disturbed individual chose to do. I nodded and said nothing, but something had shifted in me. A seed of doubt had taken root. 3 weeks after the shooting, I started asking questions. It began innocently enough, a conversation with my friend Jalen about the timeline of events, trying to make sense of the chaos in retrospect. He mentioned that his older brother Darius worked part-time at the local news station, and that the station had filed a public records request for the school's security footage and communications logs from that day. I asked if Darius could tell us what they'd found. Jalen made a face and said it was complicated, that the school district's lawyers were fighting the request, claiming the footage was protected under some student privacy exemption. That struck me as strange. If the footage showed Wesley's movements, it would be evidence in a criminal case, not a privacy issue. Why would the district fight to suppress it? The question gnawed at me. I started losing sleep. I started writing things down in a notebook, timelines and questions and half-formed theories that probably made me look paranoid. My mother noticed and gently suggested I talk to the school counselor. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was becoming obsessed. The first crack in the official narrative came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Linda Okonkwo, the principal's secretary, had been placed on administrative leave shortly after the shooting. The official reason was traumatic stress, but rumors circulated that she'd been talking to investigators about things that made the district uncomfortable. I got her contact information through a friend's parent who attended the same church, and I sent her an email explaining who I was and asking if she'd be willing to talk. I didn't expect a response. I got one within 2 hours. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She gave me her home address and told me to come alone. I drove there that Saturday afternoon, my palms sweating on the steering wheel, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Her house was a modest ranch style on a quiet street, with flower beds and a welcome mat, and nothing at all to suggest that the woman inside was about to blow my understanding of reality wide open. Linda served me lemonade and sat across from me at her kitchen table with a folder of documents she'd secretly copied before her leave began. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and I realized she was scared, genuinely scared, not of me, but of what she was about to share. She told me that Principal Whitmore had received multiple warnings about Wesley Granger in the months leading up to the shooting. The school resource officer, Deputy Terrence Coleman, had flagged Wesley's social media posts 3 times, including one from just 2 weeks before the attack that explicitly mentioned coming back to finish what they started. Deputy Coleman had submitted formal written reports to Whitmore's office each time. Linda showed me copies of those reports. They'd been marked, reviewed, and filed in Whitmore's handwriting. No action had been taken. No parents had been notified. No authorities had been called. Whitmore had decided, apparently on his own authority, that Wesley was just venting, and that involving law enforcement would ruin a young man's future over words. The words didn't stay words. 3 people were dead because of that decision. I sat in Linda's kitchen for 2 hours, reading through documents that made my blood run cold. There were emails between Whitmore and the district superintendent, a man named Dr. Franklin Bowers, discussing how to manage the situation if Wesley's threats became public. There were internal memos about liability exposure and insurance premiums, and the potential impact on the school's state funding if they were perceived as having a safety problem. There were notes from a meeting with the district's legal counsel advising against any action that could be construed as discriminatory, since Wesley had a documented history of mental health treatment. The picture that emerged was not of negligence but of calculation, a deliberate decision to prioritize the school's reputation and budget over student safety. Linda told me she'd tried to report her concerns to the school board after the shooting, but her access had been revoked, her emails had gone unanswered, and she'd been informed that her position was being restructured, effective at the end of the semester. She was being silenced. And until I walked through her door, she'd thought nobody would ever know the truth. I made copies of everything Linda had shown me and drove home in a daze, my mind racing with the implications. This wasn't just a tragedy anymore. This was a cover-up. Whitmore hadn't merely made a mistake in the heat of the moment when he dismissed the alert as a prank. He'd been systematically ignoring warnings for months, creating a paper trail of negligence that he and his superiors were now desperately trying to bury. I thought about Destiny Washington, 14 years old, killed on her way to retrieve a textbook she'd forgotten in her locker. I thought about Dr. Kimura, who'd spent 20 years teaching chemistry and coaching the academic decathlon team, gunned down trying to protect his students. I thought about Amari Oyalaran, who'd planned to study nursing and had died attempting to save a girl he barely knew. They deserved better than a cover-up. They deserved the truth. And somehow, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided I was going to be the one to give it to them. My first attempt at exposure was naive and direct. I went to the local newspaper, the Westbrook Gazette, and asked to speak with an investigative reporter. I was directed to a woman named Rachel Navarro, who had 15 years of experience covering local government and schools. I showed her Linda's documents. I explained what I believed was happening. She listened carefully, took notes, and then told me something that nearly broke me. The Gazette had already received pressure from the district's legal team not to pursue any stories that might interfere with ongoing investigations or traumatize grieving families. Their editor-in-chief, a man named Harold Prescott, had personally killed 2 articles about security failures at Westbrook in the weeks after the shooting. Rachel said she believed me, but her hands were tied. The paper wouldn't touch it. She suggested I try the regional news outlets, maybe the TV stations, but warned me that they'd likely face the same pressure. The district had deep pockets and deeper connections. This story wasn't going to break through traditional channels. I spent the next month in a fog of frustration and anger, watching Whitmore return to his position after a brief personal leave, watching the district announce a series of meaningless safety improvements that amounted to new locks on doors that were already lockable, watching the memorial trees grow while the truth stayed buried. My grades slipped. My relationships suffered. My mother sat me down one evening and asked what was really going on, and I told her everything, showed her the documents, explained what Linda had revealed. She listened in silence, her face cycling through shock and horror, and finally settling on something that looked like determination. She said we needed a lawyer. She said we couldn't fight this alone. The next morning, she called her cousin in the city, a woman named Patricia Reeves, who worked at a civil rights law firm. Patricia made some calls. Within a week, we had a meeting scheduled with an attorney named Conrad Miyamoto, a specialist in institutional negligence cases who'd successfully sued 3 school districts in the past decade. He looked at Linda's documents, asked me detailed questions about timelines and sources, and told me something I desperately needed to hear. He said we had a case. He said he'd take it. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday afternoon in late October, exactly 4 months after the shooting. The named defendants were Principal Douglas Whitmore, Superintendent Franklin Bowers, and the Westbrook Regional School District. The allegations included negligence, failure to act on credible threats, violation of mandatory reporting requirements, and wrongful death on behalf of the victims' families, who'd agreed to join the suit after Conrad's team contacted them with the evidence. The filing was immediately picked up by regional news outlets, then national ones. Suddenly, the story that the Gazette had refused to print was everywhere. Whitmore issued a statement through the district's communications office calling the lawsuit baseless and an insult to the memory of those we lost. Bowers declined to comment pending litigation. The school board held an emergency closed session meeting that lasted 6 hours. I watched it all unfold from my living room, refreshing news sites on my laptop while my mother made phone calls and my sister studied for a test she could barely focus on. The machine was finally starting to move. Discovery in a civil lawsuit is a brutal process, and Conrad Miyamoto wielded it like a surgical instrument. Subpoenas went out for emails, text messages, meeting notes, security footage, incident reports, personnel files, and every scrap of documentation the district had tried to hide. The district's lawyers fought every request, claiming privilege and privacy and procedural objections that delayed things for weeks at a time. But slowly, inexorably, the evidence emerged. We learned that Deputy Terrence Coleman had confronted Whitmore directly about Wesley's threats and been told to stop creating paperwork that makes us look bad. We learned that the automated alert system had been set up to notify Whitmore's phone first, giving him 60 seconds to override false alarms before the building-wide notification went out, and that he'd used that override function 3 times in the previous school year to suppress alerts he deemed unnecessary. We learned that the district had conducted an internal security audit 6 months before the shooting that identified the loading dock entrance as a vulnerability, and that the recommended security upgrades had been rejected as not cost-effective. Every new revelation painted a clearer picture of institutional rot. The deposition of Principal Douglas Whitmore took place over 2 days in a conference room at Conrad's law firm. I wasn't present, but Conrad showed me the video afterward. Whitmore sat at the end of a long table, flanked by 2 district attorneys, and answered questions for nearly 12 hours total. His confidence eroded visibly as the questioning progressed. In the first hour, he was calm and dismissive, attributing everything to hindsight bias and Monday morning quarterbacking. By the end of the first day, he was sweating, stumbling over his words, asking for repeated breaks. On the second day, confronted with his own emails about managing liability exposure, he finally cracked. He admitted he'd seen Deputy Coleman's reports. He admitted he'd made the decision not to escalate. He admitted he'd announced the alert as a prank without verifying with law enforcement first, because he'd been certain it was a false alarm based on his years of experience. When Conrad asked him directly whether his decisions had contributed to the deaths of Destiny Washington, Dr. Robert Kimura, and Amari Oyalaran, Whitmore's attorney objected. But the damage was done. The truth was on the record. The trial was scheduled to begin the following spring, but it never happened. In February, the district's insurance carrier conducted its own review of the evidence and informed the school board that defending the case would be futile and financially catastrophic. Settlement negotiations began immediately. The final agreement, announced in March, included substantial financial compensation for the victims' families, the immediate resignation of Principal Douglas Whitmore, the early retirement of Superintendent Franklin Bowers, a comprehensive overhaul of the district's safety protocols under independent oversight, and the release of all previously suppressed documentation to the public. Whitmore's resignation letter cited personal reasons and made no mention of his culpability. Bowers gave a brief press conference in which he expressed deep regret without ever actually apologizing. Neither of them faced criminal charges, though a grand jury investigation was ongoing, and I heard later that Wesley Granger's defense attorneys were using the evidence of institutional negligence to argue for a reduced sentence. The justice we got was incomplete. It always is. But it was something. The documents that were released as part of the settlement filled in the remaining gaps in my understanding. I read every page, every email, every memo. I learned that Whitmore had been warned about the override function's potential for misuse when it was installed, and that he'd insisted on having it anyway, because he didn't want every malfunction triggering a panic. I learned that the district had received federal grant money for security improvements that had been quietly redirected to athletic facility upgrades. I learned that Linda Okonkwo had filed an internal complaint about Whitmore's handling of the Wesley situation 3 weeks before the shooting, and that her complaint had been forwarded directly to Whitmore himself, who'd marked it, "No action required." I learned that my mother had been right, in a way, that nobody could have known exactly what would happen on that day. But I also learned that plenty of people could have known the risk was real, and they'd chosen not to act. They'd chosen to prioritize comfort over vigilance, reputation over responsibility, budgets over lives, and 3 people had paid the ultimate price for that choice. 1 year after the shooting, the families of the victims held a private memorial service at the community center downtown. I was invited because of my role in exposing the truth, and I went with my mother and Olivia, not sure what to expect or how I'd be received. Destiny Washington's mother approached me during the reception afterward. Her name was Gloria, and she had the same bright eyes and warm smile I'd seen in photos of her daughter. She took my hands in hers and thanked me for not letting them sweep it under the rug. She said Destiny would have liked me, that she'd been the kind of girl who always stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. I didn't know what to say. I told her I was sorry, that I wished I'd done more, that I wished I'd acted sooner. She shook her head and said I'd done exactly what needed to be done, exactly when it needed to be done. Then she hugged me, and I felt something break loose in my chest that had been stuck there since that day in the cafeteria, that frozen knot of helplessness and rage and survivor's guilt that had been driving me for months. I cried for the first time since the shooting. I cried for Destiny and Dr. Kimura and Amari. I cried for everyone who'd been failed by the people supposed to protect them. And when the tears finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt hope. I graduated from Westbrook Regional High School the following June, walking across a stage in the same gymnasium where Wesley Granger had been apprehended, receiving a diploma from a new principal named Dr. Christine Ibarra, who'd been brought in from outside the district specifically to rebuild trust. The ceremony was bittersweet. 3 chairs sat empty in the section reserved for seniors, draped in the school colors, honoring the classmates who should have been there but weren't. Amari's empty chair was near the front, where he would have sat alphabetically, a reminder of everything that had been stolen from us. But there was also something different in the air that day, a sense of genuine change that went beyond the cosmetic. The new security protocols were actually being implemented. The oversight board was actually meeting. The parents who'd been stonewalled for years were actually being heard. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened. Nothing would ever be enough for that. But it was a start. It was proof that the truth, once exposed, could force even the most entrenched institutions to change. That mattered. It still matters. I'm in college now, studying journalism at a university 3 states away from Westbrook. I tell people I chose this path because I want to find and tell important stories, which is true. But the deeper truth is that I'm still processing what happened, still trying to understand how so many smart, well-meaning people could fail so completely, still trying to figure out my own role in a tragedy that will define my generation. I think about that day constantly. The silence after the alert, the crackle of Whitmore's voice on the intercom, the sound of shots that I mistook for slamming lockers, the fear in my sister's eyes when I found her in the kitchen, the warmth of Gloria Washington's hands when she thanked me for fighting for her daughter's memory. These moments are part of me now, woven into the fabric of who I am and who I'm becoming. I carry them with me not as burdens, but as responsibilities, reminders of what happens when good people stay silent and bad decisions go unchallenged. Principal Whitmore told us to ignore the alert. He said someone was playing a prank. I believed him for maybe 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes haunt me still. But they also taught me something I'll never forget. Authority is not the same as accuracy. Trust must be earned, not assumed. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what you're told. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.